The sound of rain tapped lightly against the office window as Sarah Collins sat at her desk reviewing a stack of legal documents. It was late afternoon, and most of the other lawyers in the firm had already left. But Sarah wasn't the type to leave work unfinished. At 32, she had built a reputation for her sharp mind, attention to detail, and a determination that made her one of the most promising young lawyers in Boston. She glanced at her phone, the screen lighting up with a call from a number she didn't recognize. Sighing, she decided to answer. "Hello, Sarah speaking," she said, her voice calm but tired. There was a pause on the other end before a familiar but rarely heard voice spoke. "Sarah, it's Ben. From back home," the voice said. Ben Thompson had been her father's close friend and a fellow officer back when they were both working in the police department of Franklin, Indiana, a quiet, rural town that Sarah had left behind years ago. "Ben," Sarah straightened in her chair, a sudden wave of unease washing over her. She hadn't spoken to anyone from Franklin in ages. "What's going on?" There was a heavy sigh on the other end. "It's your father. Michael's in trouble. He's been accused of tampering with evidence from an old case. Something from 15 years ago. They're reopening it." Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Her father, Michael Collins, had always been a proud man, a strict police chief with a firm sense of justice. But her relationship with him had never been easy. They hadn't spoken much since she left Franklin to attend law school, and their once close bond had frayed over the years, stretched thin by silence and the unspoken tension between them. "What kind of evidence?" Sarah asked, her mind already running through possible scenarios, trying to stay focused on the facts. "It's from a case involving a young man, Greg Mason. He was convicted for a robbery, but now new evidence has surfaced, and people are saying your father might have suppressed it to make the conviction stick." Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Suppressing evidence? That didn't sound like the Michael Collins she knew, or thought she knew. "Look, I don't have all the details, but things are getting ugly," Ben continued. "Your father hasn't said much, but I know him, Sarah. He needs help, even if he won't admit it. You're the best lawyer I know. Will you come back?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, staring out at the rain-soaked streets of Boston. She hadn't been back to Franklin in years, hadn't even thought about the small town much. Her life was here now, her work, her apartment, her friends. But this was different. This was her father. "Ben, I'm not sure what I can do," Sarah began, her voice conflicted. "I haven't spoken to him in so long, and tampering with evidence, if that's true—" "I know," Ben interrupted, "but we both know Michael would never admit to needing help, and you know how small towns work. Once people start talking, it's hard to stop them. He's already being judged, Sarah. If you don't come, I'm not sure who else will stand by him." Sarah sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. She had built her career on uncovering the truth and fighting for justice, but this was personal. If she went back, it would mean facing her father, facing everything they had left unsaid. She wasn't sure she was ready for that, but what choice did she have? She was the only one who could help him. "I'll be there," she said quietly. "I'll catch the next flight." The next morning, Sarah stood at the gate of Logan International Airport, her suitcase in hand. As the boarding call for her flight to Indianapolis echoed through the terminal, she felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, guilt, and a sense of duty that tugged at her heart. She hadn't wanted to leave Franklin all those years ago, but she had felt suffocated by the small town and by her father's expectations. Michael Collins was a man of few words, a man who expected things to be done a certain way, his way. When Sarah had decided to pursue law, He had been proud, but their relationship had cooled over time as she became more independent and moved away from the town and the family he loved. Now, as she boarded the plane, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what kind of man her father had become since she left. Would he even want her help, or had the years of distance turned them into strangers? As the plane took off, Sarah stared out the window at the gray sky, her mind filled with memories of her childhood in Franklin. The town had always seemed so small, so ordinary, yet now it felt like the setting for a mystery she was about to unravel. One thing was clear: she was about to step into a world of secrets, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what she might find. The small town of Franklin looked just as Sarah remembered it, quiet, with tree-lined streets and old brick buildings that seemed untouched by time. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and the distant hum of farm equipment filled the afternoon breeze. As Sarah drove through the familiar streets, she felt a knot in her stomach. It had been years since she had last set foot here, and everything felt the same, yet different. She parked outside the modest house she grew up in, a 2-story colonial with white siding and blue shutters. Her father's car was parked in the driveway, just as she expected, but the sight of it didn't comfort her. There was a heaviness hanging over the house now, an unspoken tension that made her pause before opening the door. The front door creaked open as Sarah stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. Nothing had changed. The same photos hung on the walls, pictures of her father in his police uniform, her mother smiling by his side, and a younger version of Sarah, back when she still believed in the simplicity of small-town life. "Dad?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty hallway. There was no response. Sarah sighed and made her way to the kitchen, where she found a note on the counter in her father's neat handwriting. "Gone to the station. Be back later." Of course, he was at the station. Even after retirement, Michael Collins couldn't stay away from the place that had defined his entire life. Sarah folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, feeling a pang of disappointment. She hadn't expected a warm reunion, but the silence was worse than she had imagined. An hour later, Sarah found herself standing in front of the Franklin Police Department, a small brick building with a flagpole out front. The town's police force had always been small, just a handful of officers, and most of them had worked under her father when he was chief. Now, as she walked inside, Sarah felt the weight of their eyes on her. "Sarah Collins," a familiar voice greeted her from behind the front desk. It was Jim Anderson, one of her father's old deputies, now the acting chief of police. He gave her a nod, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Jim," Sarah replied, forcing a smile of her own. "I heard about my dad. I'm here to figure out what's going on." Jim sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's good to see you, Sarah, but I've got to be honest with you. This whole thing is a mess. People are talking, and none of it's good." Sarah crossed her arms, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "What exactly are they saying?" Jim leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's about that old Greg Mason case. You remember it, don't you? Happened when you were still in high school. Mason was convicted of robbing that gas station on Route 9. He got 20 years. Sarah nodded slowly, the details coming back to her. It had been big news at the time, an armed robbery that had shaken the quiet town. Greg Mason, a local troublemaker, had been the prime suspect, and her father had led the investigation. "Why are they reopening it now?" Sarah asked. "New evidence," Jim said, his voice grim. "Someone came forward claiming your dad suppressed a key witness statement, one that could have cleared Mason. And now that Mason's out on parole, he's raising hell about it." Sarah frowned. "Who's the witness?" Jim shook his head. That's the thing. We don't know. Whoever this witness is, they haven't come forward publicly. It's all whispers right now, but it's enough to make people start asking questions. Later that afternoon, Sarah drove to the outskirts of town, where Greg Mason's family still lived. The Mason house was a rundown, one-story building with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. She knocked on the door, and after a few moments, the door creaked open to reveal a woman in her mid-50s, with tired eyes and a deep frown. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice rough from years of smoking. "Mrs. Mason?" Sarah asked politely. "I'm Sarah Collins. I'm here to talk about your son Greg. I know who you are," Mrs. Mason interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "You're Michael Collins's daughter. What do you want?" "I'm here to find out what really happened with Greg's case," Sarah said, trying to keep her tone calm. "I know there are accusations against my father, but I need to understand the full story." Mrs. Mason crossed her arms and stared at Sarah for a long moment before stepping aside. "You might as well come in." The inside of the house was dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture and newspapers. Mrs. Mason led Sarah to the living room, where Greg himself sat on a worn-out couch, flipping through a magazine. He looked up when Sarah entered, his expression hardening. "Well, well," Greg said, tossing the magazine aside. "The great lawyer from Boston, here to defend dear old Dad, huh?" "I'm here to get to the truth," Sarah replied, standing her ground. Greg snorted. "The truth? You want the truth? Your father put me away for 15 years. I didn't rob that gas station, but he made sure the jury thought I did. And now that I'm out, I'm going to make sure the whole town knows it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "If you didn't commit the robbery, then who did?" Greg leaned back, a bitter smile on his face. "Oh, I know who did it. But your dad didn't care about finding the real criminal. He just wanted to close the case fast." Sarah's mind raced. Could it really be true? Had her father knowingly put the wrong man behind bars? The thought seemed impossible, but the anger in Greg's eyes was real. "I'm going to find out the truth," Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to Greg. Over the next few days, Sarah met with other people in town, her father's former colleagues, old neighbors, even a few of the jurors from Greg Mason's trial. Everywhere she went, there was suspicion and unease. People didn't want to talk, but there were whispers about deals made behind closed doors, about powerful figures in town who had reasons to keep the truth buried. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in her father's kitchen, sifting through old case files, she found something that made her heart stop. A report from 15 years ago, written by one of her father's officers, mentioned a witness who had seen someone else near the gas station on the night of the robbery. The witness's statement had never been brought up in court. The name of the officer who wrote the report? Ben Thompson. Sarah stared at the report, her mind racing. Could Ben have been part of the cover-up? And if so, why? What was her father hiding? The truth was starting to emerge, but it was far more complicated and dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her father's house now cloaked in darkness, the only light coming from a small lamp casting a yellow glow over the files spread before her. Her fingers traced the edges of the police report she had found earlier, Ben Thompson's report. It was a witness statement, one that could have changed the course of the trial 15 years ago, but it had never made it to court. Why? And more importantly, why had her father hidden this? Or was he forced to? The sound of the front door creaking open startled Sarah. She quickly closed the file as her father, Michael Collins, walked into the house. His tall, broad frame was still imposing, even after years of retirement. His graying hair and weathered face showed the toll of his time in the police force. But his eyes were sharp, always assessing. "You're still up?" Michael asked, his voice gruff but tinged with curiosity. Sarah sat back in her chair, watching him as he poured himself a glass of water. "I couldn't sleep," she said carefully. "I've been looking through some old case files. I found something interesting." Her father turned toward her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what would that be?" Sarah held up the report. "Ben's report from the Mason case. It mentions a witness who saw someone else near the gas station that night. That information was never brought up in court." Michael's expression hardened immediately. "You shouldn't be digging into that, Sarah." "I have to," she said firmly, standing up to face him. "I'm trying to help you, but I need to know the truth. Why wasn't this report ever used? Did you suppress it?" Michael's jaw clenched, and for a moment Sarah saw a flash of guilt in his eyes before he looked away. He set the glass down on the counter, his hand trembling slightly. "It's complicated." "It doesn't have to be," Sarah pressed. "Tell me what happened. I need to know if I'm going to defend you." Her father sighed heavily and leaned against the counter, staring down at the floor. "There are things you don't understand about how this town works. It's not as simple as right or wrong." Sarah felt a surge of frustration. "Why won't you just tell me the truth? I can't help you if you won't be honest with me." Michael looked up at her. His eyes filled with the weight of years of secrets. "You're not ready to hear it." Over the next few days, Sarah's frustration grew as her father continued to keep her at arm's length. She visited Ben Thompson, hoping to get answers from him, but the conversation left her more conflicted than ever. "Look, Sarah," Ben said as they sat in his modest home, "your dad was put in a tough spot. There were people, powerful people in town, who didn't want that case to drag on. The mayor, the district attorney, they all wanted it wrapped up fast. They thought Mason was guilty, and frankly, so did most of us. But when that witness came forward, it complicated things." Sarah frowned. "So you all just decided to bury the truth? Why didn't you speak up?" Ben looked away, guilt etched into his features. "I wanted to, but there were threats, Sarah. Threats to our careers, our families. Your father didn't want to put you and your mother at risk. He made a choice." The knot in Sarah's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about her father's pride. This was about the entire town. People in positions of power who had manipulated the justice system for their own ends. And now the consequences were coming to light. "Why now?" Sarah asked. "Why is this all coming out after so many years?" Ben sighed. "People are talking again because Greg Mason is making noise, but also because the DA's office is different now. They want to clean up old messes, especially anything that could make the previous administration look bad." Sarah sat back, her mind racing. If she defended her father, she would be protecting not just him, but everyone involved in the cover-up. But if she exposed the truth, it could ruin not only her father's reputation, but the entire town's leadership. Her father had made his choice to protect their family, but what about the innocent people who had suffered because of it? What about Greg Mason, who had spent 15 years behind bars? That night, Sarah returned home, the weight of her moral dilemma pressing down on her. She sat in her father's living room, the fireplace crackling softly in the background. Her father sat across from her in his old armchair, staring into the flames. "I talked to Ben," Sarah said quietly. Michael didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the fire. "He told me about the pressure you were under, the threats," she continued. "I understand why you did it, but that doesn't make it right." Her father's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time he looked old, worn out by years of carrying this burden. "It was a different time," Michael said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did what I thought was best for this family, for you. But what about the people who were hurt because of it?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Greg Mason lost 15 years of his life, and now I'm supposed to defend you, knowing you played a part in that. Michael looked up at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. I'm not asking you to defend me. I'm asking you to understand. Sarah swallowed hard, torn between her loyalty to her father and her own sense of justice. How could she protect him without betraying everything she believed in? How could she defend someone who had made such a terrible choice, even if it was for the sake of family? You've always been strong, Sarah, Michael said softly. Stronger than me. You have to decide what's right. I can't tell you what to do. Sarah stared at her father, her heart aching. She had spent her entire life fighting for justice, for the truth, but now that fight was threatening to tear her family apart. The people of Franklin might hate her for exposing the truth. Her father might never forgive her, but she had to make a choice, and whatever choice she made, there would be no turning back. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Sarah sat in silence, staring into the flames. She had come back to Franklin to help her father, but now she realized that helping him might mean destroying everything he had worked for. The days leading up to the trial passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. The small town of Franklin buzzed with quiet gossip, and everywhere Sarah went, she felt the weight of people's stares. It was as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for the trial to bring long-buried secrets to light. In her father's house, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Sarah had been going through the old case files, interviewing people, and preparing her defense, but something was still missing, the full truth. Every conversation with her father left her with more questions than answers, and with the trial just days away, Sarah couldn't wait any longer. It was late afternoon when Sarah found her father in the backyard, sitting on the old wooden bench beneath the large oak tree. The sky was overcast, casting a gray light over the yard. Michael sat with his hands clasped in front of him, his face creased with worry. He had always been a strong, imposing figure in her life, but now he looked small and tired, as if the weight of the years had finally caught up with him. Sarah walked over and stood in front of him, arms crossed. "Dad, we need to talk. I need to know everything, now." Michael didn't look up. "I've told you what I can, Sarah." "No, you haven't," she said, her voice firm but tinged with frustration. "I know you're trying to protect me, but I'm not a child anymore. I'm your lawyer, and I can't defend you if I don't know the full story. If we go into that courtroom without the truth, we'll lose, and it won't just be you who pays the price." Michael sighed heavily, rubbing his hands over his face. "You don't understand how complicated it is. This town, the people here, they have power, real power." "Then explain it to me," Sarah demanded, her voice rising. "You've been protecting these people for years, haven't you? The mayor, the district attorney, they're all involved, aren't they?" Michael's silence was all the confirmation she needed. "Dad," Sarah continued, her voice softening, "I need you to trust me. If you don't, I can't help you. I know there's more to this story. Why did you tamper with the evidence? Why did you let an innocent man go to prison?" At that, Michael's eyes snapped up to meet hers, a flash of anger crossing his face. "I didn't let an innocent man go to prison. That's not what happened." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Then tell me what did happen." There was a long, painful silence before Michael spoke again, his voice low and filled with regret. The real criminal, he was the son of someone powerful. A man named Robert Harris. He owned half the town back then, still does, in fact. He had money, connections, everything. His son, Jake Harris, was wild, always getting into trouble. But his father made sure he never faced any real consequences. Michael paused, as if gathering the strength to continue. The night of the robbery, Jake was there. He wasn't the one who pulled the trigger, but he was involved. There was enough evidence to charge him, but before we could, Robert Harris stepped in. He made some threats, and suddenly the pressure was on to close the case quickly. They didn't care who went to prison, as long as it wasn't Jake. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. "So you let Greg Mason take the fall?" "I didn't want to," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there was another boy, a witness, Ryan Thompson, Ben's son. He saw Jake at the gas station that night. I knew if Ryan came forward, they'd go after him too. Robert Harris would have ruined his life, so I buried the witness statement. I thought I was protecting an innocent boy." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "You tampered with the evidence to protect Ryan." Michael nodded, his eyes filled with guilt. "But in doing that, I let Greg Mason go to prison for a crime he didn't commit, and Jake Harris got away with it." Sarah's mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. The real criminal had been protected by his father's wealth and influence, and her own father had been complicit in covering it up. Now, with the trial approaching, everything was coming to light. The town's power players didn't want the truth to come out, and if Sarah continued to dig, she would be putting herself and her father in danger. "You could have come forward," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "You could have stopped this years ago." "I thought I was doing the right thing," Michael replied, his voice breaking. "But I was wrong, and now it's too late to fix it." Sarah turned away, staring out at the gray sky, her mind spinning with the weight of the revelations. If she defended her father, she would be defending a man who had covered up the truth, even if it was for what he believed to be a noble reason. But if she exposed the full truth, it would tear the town apart. The Harris family, the mayor, the district attorney, they had all played a part in this, and bringing them down would destroy the town's reputation. But what choice did she have? If she stayed silent, she would be complicit in the corruption. If she spoke out, her father would pay the price. Either way, someone would lose. "What are you going to do?" Michael asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Sarah turned back to him, her eyes filled with determination. "I'm going to the court with the truth, all of it." Her father's face fell, and for the first time, Sarah saw a hint of fear in his eyes. "Sarah, you don't know what you're up against. These people, they won't let this go easily. They'll fight back, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." "I know," Sarah said firmly, "but I'm not backing down. I became a lawyer to fight for justice, and I'm not going to stop just because it's inconvenient." Michael looked at her for a long moment, and finally he nodded. "You're stronger than I ever was." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. The truth was out now, and the weight of it pressed down on her. The real criminal was still at large, and the powerful people in Franklin were determined to keep it that way. But Sarah had made her decision. She would stand up in court, no matter the cost. As the sun began to set behind the clouds, Sarah walked back into the house, leaving her father behind in the yard. The trial was only days away, and the confrontation she had been dreading was finally here. She was ready to face it. The courtroom was packed. Franklin had always been a small town, but news of the trial had drawn in nearly every resident. Sarah Collins stood at the defense table, her hands resting on the worn wood, heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for, the moment where everything would be laid bare. Her father, Michael Collins, sat beside her, his face drawn and pale, but his eyes were focused and determined. Across the aisle sat the prosecution, led by the district attorney, Paul Evans, a man Sarah had grown up knowing, a man who had worked with her father for years. He, too, looked uneasy, though he tried to hide it beneath a mask of professionalism. Sarah knew why. This trial wasn't just about her father. It was about the entire system of power that had protected the town's elite for years. "Order in the court," Judge Edwards's voice boomed, and the murmur of voices settled into a tense silence. The trial had officially begun. The prosecution went first, painting a picture of a former police chief who had abused his power, tampered with evidence, and put an innocent man behind bars. Evans outlined how Greg Mason had spent 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, all because of a corrupt system led by Michael Collins. The prosecution's witnesses, fellow officers, townspeople, spoke hesitantly but aligned their stories with the narrative that Michael had acted alone, manipulating the case for personal reasons. Sarah sat quietly through the testimonies, her mind working quickly. She had the evidence she needed, but presenting it would mean exposing not just her father, but the entire web of corruption that had been woven around Franklin for decades. She glanced at her father, whose hands were clasped tightly in his lap. He didn't look at her, but she could see the tension in his face. He knew what was coming. When it was her turn, Sarah stood up, her heart racing, and approached the jury. She spoke calmly, clearly, but with a resolve that silenced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my father made mistakes. I'm not here to deny that. But what I will prove today is that he was not acting alone. The decisions he made, however wrong, were influenced by forces much greater than one man, and it's time for the truth to come out." The courtroom was still. All eyes were on her. Sarah called her first witness, Ben Thompson. He hesitated as he walked to the stand, glancing nervously at Michael and then at Sarah. But once seated, Sarah's questions were direct and precise, leaving little room for evasion. "Mr. Thompson, you worked closely with my father during the Greg Mason investigation, didn't you?" "Yes," Ben replied, his voice steady but strained. "And you were aware that there was a key witness, Ryan Thompson, your son, who saw someone else at the scene of the robbery?" Ben swallowed hard. "Yes. And why wasn't that witness statement presented in court?" There was a long pause, and Ben's eyes flicked to the judge, to the DA, and finally to Sarah. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "Because we were told not to." Sarah pressed on, her voice steady. "Who told you not to present the witness statement, Mr. Thompson?" Ben looked down at his hands, visibly trembling now. "Robert Harris, the mayor, the district attorney's office. They all wanted the case closed fast. They didn't care if Mason was guilty or not. They just didn't want Harris's son involved." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Sarah turned to the jury, her voice rising with conviction. "You heard that, ladies and gentlemen. My father was pressured by the town's most powerful figures to bury evidence and convict an innocent man. He didn't act alone, and those same people are still walking free today." Over the next hour, Sarah presented more evidence, old case files, buried reports, and witness testimonies that all pointed to the same conclusion. The corruption went far beyond her father. Robert Harris, the town's most powerful businessman, had used his influence to protect his son Jake and keep his reputation intact. The district attorney had complied, and many of Franklin's elite had turned a blind eye to the injustice. As Sarah spoke, she could feel the tide shifting in the courtroom. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every word. The DA's face grew paler with each revelation, while the townspeople in the audience exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, the corruption that had quietly ruled Franklin was being exposed in the light of day. When it was Michael's turn to take the stand, The courtroom held its breath. Sarah had rehearsed this moment with him, but seeing her father sitting there, vulnerable and exposed, made it all feel real in a way she hadn't expected. "Dad," Sarah began, her voice soft but clear, "why did you tamper with the evidence in Greg Mason's case?" Michael looked at her, his eyes heavy with regret. "I thought I was protecting an innocent boy, Ryan Thompson. I didn't want him to get caught in the crossfire, but I realize now I was wrong. I should have told the truth, no matter the cost." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "And who pressured you to bury the evidence?" Michael took a deep breath. "Robert Harris. He made it clear that if I didn't comply, he'd ruin my career, and worse, he threatened our family." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The truth was out. Everything her father had tried to protect had come crumbling down, but in that moment, Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of the secrets, the lies, they were finally lifted. In the closing arguments, Sarah stood before the jury once more, her heart heavy but resolute. "My father made a terrible mistake. He tampered with evidence, and because of that, an innocent man lost 15 years of his life. He is guilty of that. But he wasn't alone in his actions. The people in power, the ones who truly controlled Franklin, they're the ones who need to be held accountable. This trial isn't just about one man's mistake. It's about a system that has been corrupt for far too long." When the jury returned with their verdict, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Michael was found guilty of tampering with evidence, but the charges were reduced, acknowledging the role that external pressure had played. He would face consequences, likely a short sentence and the loss of his reputation, but the truth was out. Robert Harris and several other town officials were under investigation, and the town of Franklin would never be the same. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah sat beside her father, a mixture of sadness and relief in her chest. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "You did the right thing, Sarah," he said quietly. "I hope so," she replied, her voice soft. "It doesn't feel like a victory." "It's not about winning," Michael said. "It's about doing what's right. And you did." Sarah nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. The battle was over, but the fight for justice would continue. She had chosen the path of truth, even when it meant facing the hardest of truths about her own family. And in the end, that was what mattered most.